In a world of fractured stories, timelines buried, and truths erased, one project dares to ask the question, what if everything you thought you knew about history was wrong? This is GTR, Genesis, Timeline and Roots. A 5,025-year simulated walkthrough tracing a melanated Adam back to 4000 BC. Over the last decade, new revelations confirm a black origin for humanity, from European vaults to tribal memory, Babylon to Britain. This is not just history, this is a challenge, a simulation, a movement. Meet the man behind GTR, Dr. Wilton MacDonald II, Caymanian, British, Jamaican, haplogroup E and stateless for 26 years. Now a global explorer, 119 countries and counting. A hedge fund lawyer, a UK chartered accountant, a seeker of the lost archives of our people. But the question remains, if all black people came out of Africa, does that make us only African? Or are we also European, Scottish, Native American, Jacobite Hebrew, Asian? GTR exists to answer that question. You've felt it your entire life, that there's something wrong with the world. A splinter in your mind. That splinter has brought you here, to GTR. Whites can't trace their roots before the 1800s. Where's ours? Where are the tribes? The languages, the kings, the queens, the true Hebrews? Where did the giants go? Where are the Neanderthals? Angels, aliens? Why do we speak in so many tongues? Was Babel just a myth? A memory? History has holes. Hollywood has lied. The system was never made for us to remember. Only 5 to 8% of people today are white. And what about the 1800 stories and postcards of the Cabbage babies? But nearly all history books center their story. That doesn't add up. Atlantis, lost cities, vanished civilizations, or were they erased? Try GTR. Take the red pill and awaken to the truth of your ancestors. Or take the blue pill and keep dreaming a fantasy. GTR. A simulated walkthrough of Black Hebrew history and eschatology. This is the beginning of remembering.
Well, hello, Cayman. This is your host, Dr. Wilton MacDonald, and I'm presenting episode 5, GTR, Genesis, Timeline, Roots. And this is a follow-up on the last episode, which is episode 4, which was featuring the Beachy Head Woman story presented by the BBC, turning literally brown color to white and changing the narrative, knowing already that there were scores of findings of the Bangle lady, the Cheddar Man. So many accounts and stories of actual melanated persons in the UK and in Europe. And I delved into the primary sources, of course, with Dr. Marie Charles and presenting 22 books. There's been so much coming out in the last 5 years. So this episode will focus on some of the primary sources and testimonies of persons who witnessed the Meadow Cabbage babies and their parents, their grandparents, great-grandparents. We need to weigh the evidence. We're presented with this new story, this new revelation that Europe, the oldest female British woman, was a Caucasian woman with blonde hair and blue eyes. That's the Beachy Head Woman. And so the primary sources that we have now available would, of course, include Dr. Marie Charles. Her 22 books would include Dr. John Johnson, his book on the Negro rulers of Scotland and the British Isles, would include the Vlad Putin's revelation with Black Russian icons. We have David McRitchie, which he wrote about the ancient Britons. We have a lot of missing sources. I would love to get hold of the Cornelius Tacitus books. And we said the Nazis found one, Germania, which I don't have any faith in the veracity of those sort of tales and the authenticity of that book. Even commonsensically, they can't find 20 books, and they found the one book that codified and confirmed this Aryan race, proven not to be superior. Jesse Owens did a marvelous job in debunking the superior race position that was put forth by Nazi Germany. And you imagine if you had other Blacks who had opportunities and the funding, there would be a lot more Jesse Owens in the 1936 Olympics. But not just dwelling on those points. We have to weigh the evidences. We have to look at the primary sources, the Bayeux Tapestry, the Magna Carta, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles. We have to weigh in on those primary sources and not just take the word of screenwriters and movie directors when they present the information, like all of our history. And then sadly, even the museums, the famous ones, the Louvre, the Vatican, the Metropolitan, the British Museum, these statues, paintings, the icons in all of these famous museums. How, if everyone living and alive from the time of Christ, even into ancient Greek and Roman days, were Caucasian, then how do you explain that we have not even 10%, barely, non-Hispanic whites today? How do you explain the small numbers? Shouldn't the planet be like 95% white today? We went from 700 million to 8 billion in not even 300 years. During the time of Christ, we had 150 million people. 150 million. That alone will debunk any evolution story. How many years does it take to make 150 million? Our timeline is important. The GTR's mission to have a timeline that works and that's effective and makes sense. We have population documented, confirmed by the United Nations, 150 million people during the time of Christ. And then we have population stats going back 300 years ago, 700 million people or less. We have the atrocities. And whether you think and believe that the transatlantic slave stories, okay, we had movements of people around the world. Obviously, there were whites that were placed, we were told as kids, as orphans, in South Africa, in Australia, in New Zealand. in Argentina, just sent to places. So there was movement, a lot of movement in the 1800s, or I'd say 800s, because the year should be 1025, 1026, and not 2025, 2026. We're living in the wrong year. The Middle Ages were never dark. They just never existed. So the timeline has to make sense. And the stories that we're told and we see in books and films, they have to make sense. And we need to track demographics. You take a certain set of people, be it Indian or Chinese, Japanese, or white Anglo-Saxon, and you trace the lineage. You trace the roots as far back as you can go. And you have to then try to regress those numbers. That's simple math, folks. Simple math that children can do. And how can you disengage with your intellect, your brain? How can you just enter fantasy land? When a lot of movies are made, they usually start, whether it be Disney or some other production company, say, well, some of what the narrator makes clear and lays out the disclaimers. Some of what I'm going to say is based on fact, and others based on fiction and fairy tale. So you set a base. I mean, name it, movies that are talking about history or treating some of the things that they would tell you and show you in the movies and treating it as facts. So it's laughable, and we need to test these primary sources. So part of this discussion, before I jump into episode 6, and episode 6 is going to be special for me, giving you a little preview, because in episode 6 I will talk about my own genealogy and go in it with my dad, who is Dr. McDonald Sr., a retired pastor, just celebrated his 80th birthday, and we will go into the specifics of those lines, but that's episode 6 to come, and I want to prepare you for that, and I look forward to sharing. Episode 5, we're clearing up some of the post-Britain, Black Europe, and Beachy Head Woman sources, especially with the Meadow Cabbage Babies. But just to share a little bit about what's to follow in episode 6 of my own ancestry, then I present just this slide. So My Heritage was the first DNA company that I used before going into Ancestry, 23andMe, and My Heritage was really the first. You have gene by gene and family tree DNA, but then I finished up, and I've been using private sources, private labs, where I have so much information, and I can identify those research gaps, things that don't make sense, matches which were never made, but then they just popped out on the woodwork once I used private labs. And so My Heritage presented my original ethnic profile, which made sense. My dad's maternal grandpa, George Potts, was white, and so that DNA gets classed as European. And some of us who have done DNA tests, we've seen the changes and transformation as they upgrade the stats, which in a lot of cases don't make sense. So my original profile was 8% Irish, Scottish, or 8% European. South Asian is 53%, Filipino 1%, Nigerian, African, I know it's there, but at 27 plus then 9, roughly 40% African, and that's fine as well. But then it changed in the last 6 to 12 months. We now have a version 2.5. And I know some of you, a lot of you have done the DNA testing and you've lost matches, lost cousins. I guess some cousins don't want, brown and black folk contacting them, and you have to call it as you see it. Nigerian, now 56.6%, West African 2, East Africa 1, Central Africa 1, no European DNA, and then South Asian. Everyone that knows my mom knows that she's full Indian. In fact, it's so laughable that the same DNA testing company will show that my mom is fully Indian. And so according to the revised stats, I am 38%. So I go to my mom, and yes, they are constantly revising. And they're revising again the ethnicity. And my mom has always been 100% East Indian. Here again, I was just clicking on her stats, and they are running the numbers again. But she comes out to be 100%. So half of your parent, half of 100% should be 50. So the first profile made sense. This one doesn't, but they're still running the numbers. So I'll stop presenting. So I'll go right now into the backup to the primary sources, which would include a video. Now, there are two main sources that I have really been impressed with. The work by Guy Anderson, and I will read some of his accounts and what people have shared with Guy Anderson, a former Freemason. And then this group called Minds Unveiled. I've reached out to them, but they don't want to be identified. I can only assume that they too are linked to some, Masonic group. Who knows, their parents are Masons, but they have not disclosed. They call themselves Sun and Moon. So before this video gets wiped out, I want to play the video in full so that you could see for yourself those postcards that were showing up in episode 4. Now you see the full video. So without further delay, let me play that video and share with you.
On Old World Photoshop, we began to notice a trend with old postcards from the 1900s showing early examples of compositing. There isn't much information on these. If there's a catalog, it's not easy to come by. But many of these are early examples of photo manipulation. They had surreal, real photo postcards, in which they would attempt to trick people with the illusion of photography. As we continued to look through these old postcards, a very strange and unsettling trend started to become apparent. It began with just simple baby postcards. At first thought, it seems like any ordinary postcard. But as with the same sky postcard mystery, where the author began to see a trend of a variety of postcards, well, there's a category of postcards that deserves its own name and label, but it doesn't seem very well known, as there are no websites or videos explaining this topic. We shall call it the mystery of the repopulation postcards. There are other names for this style, such as baby postcards. By the end of this video, you'll be shocked at how many of these there are. We're talking in the thousands. We found one reference to what these cards were in a book on Amazon named Babylon, Surreal Babies, in which the author describes these same peculiar 1900s postcards and how they were deeply influential to many famous artists, including Salvador Dali, yet the author even admits that little is known of their history. In order to understand why we've labeled them repopulation postcards, a thorough understanding of resets, tartaria, orphan trains, incubators, asylums, and oddfellows will be necessary. These cards depict babies being grown. There are many different styles within this category. One of the most interesting is the Cabbage Patch Babies, a variety of themes involving growing babies. Babies on plants, babies on mushrooms, babies in the water, babies in a nest, babies in eggs being hatched. Then the babies arrive on the train. There's something eerie about these photos, as if someone's trying to tell us something.
We've also got kids in Cabbage Patches. Does this have anything to do with the Cabbage Patch Kids? So where do babies come from? In the early 1900s, the most common answer given to children would simply be that the stork would bring the babies, or that they were found in a cabbage patch. But why would babies be found in cabbage patches? The legend of the Cabbage Patch Kids involves a young boy named Xavier who meets a mystical fairy bunny bee creature, so a hybrid or chimera, and he follows this bunny bee through a secret tunnel behind a waterfall. On the other side of this waterfall, he finds that babies are being produced in a cabbage patch. The stork, known as Colonel Casey, would then come and pick up the babies. He even has his own uniform. So he's a worker, a soldier, as well as the Cabbage Patch Kids' official historian that would then deliver the babies to their new homes. Not only that, but there's an evil witch named Lavender McDay. She and her weasel and jackrabbit henchmen are literally trying to enslave the Cabbage Patch Kids to be miners to dig for gold in the valley. You can get all the exposition for the lore in the story through their 10-song album. It goes over how they were created, to the witch, to even a lament about their enslavement. It's pretty dark. The original concept for the cloth dolls was created by Martha Nelson Thomas, and she called them doll babies. And the story really had nothing to do with cabbages or chimeras or witches. It wasn't until Xavier Roberts, or Xavier, like the little boy in the story, hijacked her design that it became what it is today. So I can't help but wonder if Xavier Roberts just came up with the story all on his own. Like, did it come to him from the collective consciousness? Or does he just have a soft spot for child labor? There's actually a place you can go in White County, Georgia, where they do live births, and you can look it up on YouTube to see what I'm talking about. The bunny bee character also is a hybrid creature of two animals that both symbolize rebirth and resurrection on a mass scale. As we know, rabbits reproduce in droves, and the bee symbolism makes me think of a hive, or queen or source where all the offsprings originate from. It would seem that this is some sort of reference to babies being created in a lab on a mass scale. Why were there so many orphans? Most common answer will be, the baby boom. But this didn't happen until 1946 to 1964. These postcards are from 1890 to 1910. And there's really no explanation for the burst of orphans that we see being brought into the United States, or the amount of orphanages and asylums that exist that no longer seem to be necessary. Could the baby boom narrative be a way to sweep this part of history under the rug? The orphanages were all shut down, and after the 60s, people just stopped having babies and getting married after World War II, according to the narrative. Then there were the incubators of the 1900s. It's difficult to keep premature babies alive with modern technology, yet they were doing this back in 1835 in Europe. They turned this into a sideshow, where at the world fairs they would show off these child hatcheries, these incubators of live children, and for some reason, the royals would come and witness these events. So there's this genetic manipulation cloning idea, in which these babies are actually being grown in some sort of pods. Perhaps the symbolism of the Cabbage Patch mirrors that process. Humans do resemble plants in the way that we're connected to a stem in our fetal state, and our whole lives are spent ripening. In the fetal abduction theory, we typically see a nurse-looking woman with either a fishing hook or a fishing net pulling a child out of the water. Perhaps the hook and net represent medical tools and the water amniotic fluid. In either scenario, it would make sense that these babies have to end up in incubators or hatcheries. And it begs the question, how did all these premature babies get here? If women back in, these days were having babies prematurely, why in such large numbers? And the babies all being babies, they'd have to have traveled there somehow within a short period of time. What are the chances that so many premature babies were driven from wherever their mothers were to these incubators all in time? And why did they charge people to view them, as if this was some sort of exhibition or sideshow, and not a pressing matter of life and death? For centuries, the stork has been thought of as a symbol for new beginnings and family lineage. The idea that this creature represents life-giving events also makes sense because storks are monogamous creatures, and they mate only once every year with their partners that they've chosen beforehand, choosing mates based solely on personality instead of looks, like many other birds. Now we've got kids inside a train. Orphan trains. Why so many orphans? Were these orphans taken from their families? Were they trained to instruct a new generation of genetically created babies? Or were they womb-napped babies? And we've got kids growing on trees. Kids being carried by storks. The Greek goddess Hera and her Roman counterpart Juno also favor the stork. And I'm sure you guys remember that quirky little teen pregnancy movie from the 2000s. And I suspect that Artemis of Ephesus is an ancient fertility symbol used by the elite to signify their ability to reseed a new population. So we've got hooks removing babies, kids in the water with a woman holding a net or fishing rod. Is the water the amniotic fluid, pulling children from the wombs of their mothers perhaps? Could that be why there are so many premature babies? Or are they genetically manipulated? Cloning is not impossible. Just look at Miracle Millie. I think that the movie Aeon Flux is a great example. Hollywood is definitely alluding to this reality of artificial repopulation. The Cabbage Patch Kids sort of reminds me of those medieval occult books that depict humans growing from roots in the grounds or mandrakes, which are known to have occult properties for making one go insane.
The babies are also ready to join their elite clubs, and they're even given top hats. Technology, clothes, and empty cities? Babies floating in on boats, all signifying children being born or found and then taken by the mother. The one with the basket. Yet, this is a figure that represents the government's function as a mother, a corporate operation of generating foundlings in order to fill their newly emptied and burned cities with new humans. Whoever made these postcards are trying to tell us something very dark about the world we live in, as if it's humorous. There's an extraordinary amount of work put into these early photo manipulations. One would think there should be a good resource for these old postcards, but they are rare and difficult to find. Babies with hats. Babies in the empty cities. Babies with new technology. Babies in the classroom. Babies being brought in boats. And babies being grown in a variety of different situations. Is this some type of clever reference to the cloning of humans? We know of the sudden rise in orphans during the 1800s, but where do they all come from? Where do babies come from? All we can hope is that our minds may be unveiled.
Let go of everything you think to be true. Relax the mind and ask the question, do I truly understand what this reality is?
Yes, well, we're back, and thanks again for watching that video. It's the most riveting, most revealing of all, going through the postcards in the same group, Mind Unveiled. Again, I contacted them several times. They just don't want to be, to be outed. They don't want to be in the public space. So I've shared the video. If you look at the back of the video, at the end, you will see that there are comments. These are live comments where people are talking about their parents, where they're coming from. Some said my great-grandmother told me babies came from a cabbage patch. I weighed in and had my own views and placed in the comments. No one has really responded, and there's been no additional from the time the video came out, which was more than a year ago. There's just been not much activity, but a lot of people, 3,000 comments, talking from different countries. In France, saying, well, neither my grandparents knew their birthdays. Spouses talking about their ancestry. Hello, everyone. I'm from Russia, Siberia. Stories there, stories from Poland, even my own very wife, speaking about the odd blanks. Can't go back further than 1890. My wife's family trees. And some people are saying the Cabbage Patch, the postcards, came with adoption papers. Other people are just talking about Polish. There's a Polish grandmother talking about her story in the Cabbage Patch Kids. Or vampirism, no, that's a bit more fantasy, but my grandma was an orphan, 1907, had 2 sons. She didn't speak about this stuff. People didn't comment, didn't talk about it. Funny enough, my own father, and I'm going to try and get as much info that I can from him in episode 6, but Caribbean folk, same way. Dad, tell me about your parents. Tell me about your childhood. People don't talk about it. So no one's talking about history. The melanated, the blacks, they just assume, oh, well, just automatically African. Not dismissing the out of Africa theory, just that most of our black melanated people left Africa 1,000+ years ago, 2,000 years ago. Not quite 200, 300, 400 years ago. That represented a reverse diaspora. Black people coming into Africa and not so much out. And people talking about orphanages here. There's so many comments to go through. The reference to the Garbage Pail Kids. After the Cabbage Patch Kids lost its flavor, we had the Garbage Pail Kids. And my grandmother, she was saying, well, down to the Cabbage Patch, French speakers, because these cards were in different languages, Dutch, German, Russian, English, French, and talking that it was a term of affection. Oh, my little cabbage baby, my little cabbage patch cutie. My grandma was 101 and she died a few months ago, and she just never spoke about those things. My grandfather was placed in an orphanage, and his parents worked different industry, coal mine. Someone alluding to the biblical story of Moses. They see all the water. My great grandma and the mother was dropped off on the doorstep, foundling. French description talking about terms of endearment. Sayings in South Carolina, you look like you fell off a cabbage truck. My maternal grandmother, the hospital, mental health, sweetest lady. She married 15 years of age. A lot of blank spaces. Recollections, people in the community. My mother was 87. Children came from the Cabbage Patch. I'm going to stop presenting. So I will continue with Guy Anderson's book. And I played a clip in episode 4 with Guy Anderson talking about the Cabbage Meadow Babies. So I will present some of the stories and actual accounts. I'll just read a few. My grandfather was born on the 5th of August in 1907 as Clifford Van Nostrand. His baptismal certificate was dated November of 1907. He was brought to New York Foundling Hospital on that day, 3 months old. As with many other children, his mother was single and couldn't afford him. Last year, I paid for and got my grandfather's birth certificate from New York City. It was created for him in 1942 when he needed it for Social Security. In July 1912, as seen on his birth certificate, copy is there provided. He was loaded onto a train with other children and rode to Chicago, Illinois. As far as my grandpa said, it was a stopping point where people that had adopted children were picking them up. My grandpa, along with a little girl named Agnes Fitzgerald, were adopted by Alfred and Elsie Prairie from Momence, Illinois. They met the train and picked up my grandpa, Clifford, and Agnes. Agnes was 4 at the time and was born in 1908. The Prairies were very quiet people, very kind parents, and many wish they had. They were Catholic folks and farmers at the time when they adopted these 2 orphan train riders. My grandpa grew up knowing his biological mother's name was Emma Van Nostrand. My grandma, his wife, also passed that on to my mother and then to me. We really think that the Prairies had to have some affiliation with someone pretty important people at the New York Foundling Hospital, as otherwise they have known the birth mother's name. We know nothing of his father's. My mother sent off her DNA for testing through Ancestry.com, and I have uploaded it to other sites. I now work with the search angel to find the correct Emma in New York City, whom was his biological mother, and hopefully will find who his father was also. My grandfather ended up being a bricklayer, as Alfred Prairie had taught him his trade. My aunt, that was adopted along with Clifford, was a hardworking woman as a waitress and met a wonderful man and married him. My grandfather married my grandmother in 1929, and they had 3 children. I say that was the most wonderful outcome they could have hoped for, being an orphan train rider. I will not give up trying to find my grandfather's biological mother and father and hope that it will heal his heart and mine. Christine O'Hara. Another one by Barbara Harley. And blood tests were required by both parents before a marriage license would be approved. And when we applied for a marriage license in May 1972, we were instructed to get a blood test before our license would be approved. We were married by a Justice of the Peace in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in June 1972, where we were told that the blood test was to check if our blood was compatible, something to do with Rh negative factor. Nothing was ever mentioned to either of us about venereal disease. We were told it was to check blood compatibility, because if one partner was Rh negative and the other one wasn't, the mother would abort the embryo because her body would see it as a foreign substance. As most babies born in hospitals after the Second World War had their blood tested at birth, I personally think that by 2019, the premarital blood tests were no longer needed to track bloodlines. When it began in the late 1930s, states began to pass laws requiring couples to take blood tests. Before applying for marriage licenses, the public were told these tests were for venereal disease, most commonly syphilis, genetic disorders, sickle cell, anemia, rubella. The tests were part of a public health campaign enacted by U.S. Surgeon General Thomas Parran in the late 1930s. However, premarital blood testing had nothing to do with the potential for venereal disease. In reality, it was instituted in the 1930s due to concerns about compatibility between each person's blood types and to ensure compatibility with their offspring. In 2019, all 50 states officially repealed the blood test requirement for marriage. Montana was the last state to repeal this requirement in 2019. And that's by Barbara Harley. Okay, here's an actual orphan train. There it is. Actual photograph. My father, James Marks Ross, was born May 5th, 1913, named Joseph Max Furlander. Through DNA testing, I discovered that my dad was 100% Jewish. His birth mother was Fanny Furlander. She was 16 years old at the time of his birth. We determined that she came across the ocean on a boat, along with her mother, father, and brother Willie. She was an Ashkenazi Jew, so we determined that she was most likely lived in northern Russia with her parents. It is more likely that she came across the waters whilst pregnant, and my DNA shows I am half Jewish. Whatever that means, really. So my dad would have been 100% Jewish Ashkenazi Jew. This means my dad's father would have been Jewish also, but I never found out anything about him. During my research, we found out he was born May 5th, 1913 at Beth Israel Hospital in New York City. 13 days after he was born, his mother turned him over to the New York Foundling Hospital, stating she could not take care of him. We don't have any information on what his life was like for 3 years, but his adoptive parents, James and Myrtle Ross, had girls and wanted a boy to continue the family name. They wrote to the Foundling Hospital requesting a healthy boy. He was identified with a number, 32. I don't know how many states and towns he stopped in before reaching the Grand Rapids in Minnesota. When he arrived, he was cleaned up and stood on the flatbed trailer of the train. Thus came the term up for adoption. But he had the number pinned on his clothing, so it was known that he was already spoken for. Dad told us that he recalled a nurse came home with his family who had been on the train for a period of time. His parents were led to believe that he came from Belgium, per the country's comment, instead of northern Russia. I believe at that time it would be difficult to swallow adopting a Jewish child. He lived with them for several years, and they decided to adopt him to make him an official part of the family when he was 9 years old. I could go on more about his life, but this is a summary of his birth and the orphan train ride he took. With some circumstances behind that event, I wish I had so much more than I do about his birth and his few years in New York City, but I stopped searching. Perhaps I will start back up again. Julie Evans, and photograph of an actual orphan train. Okay, so let me go again. Daniel was born in Boston, Massachusetts, USA in 1886 to Irish immigrant parents. He had older siblings but knew nothing of them because he was taken in after his parents died when he was young. I have tried many times to probe a little as to what actually happened. The general response of muted dismissal of the subject had led me to imagine that something sinister must have taken place. I stopped asking. To have lost both parents at the same time and for there to be no knowledge within the family as to circumstances has always struck me as odd. I was just talked about, and I've been trying to piece the story together. Daniel was raised by a 50-plus-year-old father of 7 and his wife, who apparently an aunt, within a strict Roman Catholic family. I'm told Daniel's late father was named Lynch, but know nothing of his birth parents. I'm personally doubtful that his adoptive mother was really his aunt. It seems young Daniel was also kept in the dark about his past and birth family. He had the unnerving experience when attending a social event in his teens of having an adult woman covertly approaching him and saying simply, "Excuse me, I think I'm your sister." She had recognized her younger brother from years before and wanted to alert him to her existence. This sort of story had been trotted out to so many times that it's only now that I look fresh at it and find the whole thing quite incredible. To be approached by a sibling in this way and find out about her for the first time must have affected the young man. Daniel had several adoptive cousins who he regarded as siblings. 2 of his adopted uncles became priests. One in particular was very connected with government and military. In fact, the family relocated to Washington for this reason. This sibling had suffered a nervous breakdown as a youth. Around the time that Daniel was adopted into the family, he was later given positions with government and wrote glowingly about his traditions taken up in 1776 and how important it was to the country to uphold them. Daniel himself became a judge, and he was steered in the same direction of government military by his adoptive family. He was on to father the 3 children of his own and was able to find them places in the State Department. Daniel's son my grandfather was introduced to an associate of his, one of J. Edgar Hoover, who immediately recruited him fresh from college straight into the FBI sometime in the 1930s. James Walton Ingram. Orphans from New York about to board the orphan train. Julia Elise Dyer was born on October 15, 1849 in New York City to William W. Dyer, a carpenter, and Julia Sarah Wilding. Her early years were marked by hardship. Her father died during the Crimean War, and by 1860, her mother had also passed away, leaving Julia and her younger brother orphaned. At age 10, Julia was admitted to the Friendless Society in New York, recommended by Miss Perry of the Mariners Family Asylum on Staten Island. While her brother was taken by their paternal aunt, Mrs. William Brown, their grandmother, Mary Dyer, was herself in poor health and residing in the same asylum. In 1861, Julia was formally committed to the Friendless Society by Edward C. West after being dismissed by her aunt's care. Just 3 years later, in 1864, Julia's life changed dramatically. At age 14, she was sent west on the orphan train, part of a movement that relocated orphan children to new homes across the American Midwest. She was indentured to James Rice in Westfield, Bureau County, Illinois. Despite a difficult start in life, Julia began to build a future. She joined the Malden Methodist Church in 1868, signaling her growing connection to the Illinois community. By 1870, she was working as a domestic servant for Catherine Gaynor in Bureau County. That same year, she was photographed alongside George O. Lloyd, a picture labeled simply George O. Lloyd and Lady, a symbolic moment in her transformation from orphan to wife. Julia and George were married on November 24, 1870 in Lamoille, Illinois. The ceremony was conducted by Pastor William Green, witnessed by S.J. Green and his daughter Alice. The couple had 3 children, George F., Harry, and Lutie. Their early marriage was not without turmoil. In 1871, George was arrested for whipping Julia, a painful chapter preserved in court records. With testimony from Martin H. McMahon, yet Julia endured. Over the next 6 decades, she created a stable family life in Bloomington, Illinois, where she remained for the rest of her life. Oh, the photograph looks like Julia. The Lloyd's home on Boone Street became the family's center. Julia was listed as head of household in the 1880 and 1900 censuses, and by 1910, she and George had raised 3 children, 2 of whom survived into adulthood. George worked as a bricklayer and plasterer. Julia managed the household. After George's death in 1919, she applied for a widow's pension from his Civil War service. And there's a photograph of Julia. Julia remained active in her community and faith. She was a dedicated member of the Women's Relief Corps, a support group for Union veterans and their families, and stayed involved with the First Methodist Episcopal Church. She was a regular figure in Memorial Day events and was noted in local newspapers for her charitable and civic contributions. In her later years, Julia lived with her daughter Lutie and grandson Lloyd. Even after a fractured leg in 1925 and several hospitalizations in the early 1930s, she remained mentally sharp, socially engaged. On July 16, 1936, Julia passed away at St. Joseph Hospital in Bloomington at the age of 86. Her death was attributed to myocarditis with senility and arteriosclerosis as contributing factors. Her funeral was held at Beck Memorial Home, with services conducted by the Women's Relief Corps. honoring her lifetime of service. Julie was buried at Bloomington Cemetery, her legacy marked by strength, faith, and quiet perseverance. She was survived by her daughter, Ludi Fluence, along with grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Her sons, George F. and Harry Lloyd, had predeceased her. Julia's life is a powerful testament to resilience, a girl orphaned in New York who crossed the country on an orphan train and went on to live a long and meaningful life in the heart of America, by Pam Kane. So it is that we have been given evidence and sources about people's testimonies, their recollections, and for this to be considered in the mix. We add all of the above, all of the aforementioned primary sources for you as the audience to gauge, to re-engage and connect your intellect with those factual bits and primary sources, not to just accept the narrative. And I know this is the season to be jolly, the season that we will commemorate and remember and recall the life of Christ and all that comes with it, looking at the new year. But our new year resolution should be one where we should be focused on changing that narrative and not being scared and saying, well, we may lose power for those, clinging and benefiting economically, benefiting from that elevated status afforded to just one set of people on the planet. Those persons who are clearly in the minority, but they influence so much of how we process the past, how we live, how we spend money, how we communicate, what we read, what we read in the press, and what all our senses, our faculties are just determined. Even the foods we eat, the water. I mean, it boils down to those people who are titans of industry, the billionaires and millionaires. Of 57 million millionaires, not even 2% would be Black. And not everyone just will report their wealth, but even if you want to increase that number, you will not even pass 4%. And the billionaire list is more public. People would tell if someone, has, a net worth of $1 billion or more dollars, and these people are very hard to be invisible. And so we have, out of 3,100, we have not even 25, including Oprah and all the celebrities who are billionaires, Black billionaires. Not even 1%. 1% would be 31 people. 1%. And this is that we have to re-engage our intellect, our thoughts, our minds to the numbers and just think. Take 5 minutes out, take 10 minutes out. I certainly don't have all the answers. No one has. But taking time to just process and think about those primary sources. My parents did something in not having television in the home and keeping that away. We did not have television growing up. My wife would laugh growing up in communist Poland that they had 2 channels. But I'm thankful. I respect my parents' decision because I was a just voracious reader and just going through encyclopedias and information and libraries, books, and soaking up that knowledge, being able to go off to university at 15 and finishing with 3 degrees before turning, 20 or even closer to 19. But it took a lot of preparation and the preparatory work, which helped me to understand the world and to sift, what you say, truth from error. This process has been something I've been just working on and just thankful. I mean, being thankful to God and connected to spiritual power to just try and advance in GTR in the mission to uncover truths and facts about our history, about who we are as a people, and then for us to make intelligent choices and decisions based on those truths. And I think it's time for the people of color to be given full faith and credit for their contributions and our history, which has been blotted out and whitewashed. And as I continue my journey, there's so much of the hateful comments. I mean, less now, but always attacked. Blacks contributed nothing. Our God is white. Blacks have been closely assigned to just animals. First thing comes to mind is a monkey. And I smiled to myself and I said, you know, the ignorant, I just don't have time or even patience with that. You know, when you even examine an animal, you examine a monkey, straight here, very, very thin lips, almost no lips. And you take off the hair and you look in the underskin, you'd find pink flesh, no melanin at all. So then you accuse me and you say it's a black person, you're a monkey, when even scientists will just decode a monkey and there's no animal DNA. And I end with this point that 23andMe are the only bankrupt company. They have an index, which is called the Neanderthal Index. And in that, most of my family members, we've done that. So my mom's Indian, my wife is white, Polish. Yes, she's a white woman. And we all have done those tests. And my dad being 80% black, he also did the test. And turns out he scored the least on that Neanderthal index. And it's not proportionate. I mean, he scored like 1%. Because his maternal grandfather, George Potts, was white. So, you know, he scored a 1%. My wife and my mother was Indian. So my wife's white, my mom's Indian. They scored well beyond 70 to 90% in the Neanderthal index. And for me, I scored like a 4%. My kids are somewhere around 8%. So it's not a proportion. It's not, you know, whenever you have more melanin, obviously your score would, if you have, okay, but if you have just more melanin, it's not a proportional scale. So my kids, which are clearly, they are 25% black, they're scoring around 8%. So you think, well, they should be 25%, call it 75% based on my mom's and my wife's score. So somewhere around 60. But they're not. They're around 8%. And the Neanderthal, call it non-black, call it a non-black index. So it's not a proportionate scale. It's, if you have more melanin, you will score, your score then would fall. Your Neanderthal score falls dramatically and in the single digits. So there you have it. I will pause and I will be presenting episode 6 which would look at my own genealogy. That's something that I really, really look forward to. I'm already working on the script for that. And these are largely impromptu, and I guess it just is better for me while I'm making videos during vacation on the go. But I will present episode 6. I'll upload it shortly. But for now, I wish everyone good evening, good night, good morning, wherever you are. And this is the conclusion of episode 5, looking at the deeper primary sources as it relates to episode 4, and the stories of the Cabbage Babies and the orphan trains, melanated Europe, as people would judge for themselves the authenticity of the whole story, the Beachy Head Woman, and you be the judge of that, for her whole background to be changed from African to European, which I don't understand, what that means even now with all the evidences, what to be a European would constitute. But they said she's European, she's white, blue-eyed, no longer brown, no longer black, no longer African. So I'd leave it as that. Thank you. Good night.
GTR Publishing.
A Data Dreads production.